Hello, botany students. It's Professor Fernatovich back with our introductory botany lecture. So we left off looking at coral, mushrooms, plant, or animal. Well, it turns out that coral are animals, even though they look like plants, and mushrooms are neither. And of course, we have more diversity in the living world than what has been shown so far. But it's just to say that sometimes it takes a little bit of sleuthing to figure out where something belongs in a system where we group things. So it's not as easy as just looking at the appearance of an organism, but we have to delve deeper. So historically, we're talking about European study of botany. European explorers went out and studied new areas. They went and colonized different parts of the world and discovered new and curious creatures out there and cataloged them. So that is kind of what we see historically. And the cataloging was kind of a first round, a rough draft, and things have evolved since then. And I'm using the word evolved in a very loose way. Things have changed since then. By the mid-1800s, biologists realized that the two-kingdom system wasn't right. It didn't really reflect all the complexity that we see. There are some things that are easy to look at. Plants and animals. We've got goldenrod in the picture on the left, a bald eagle on the right. They clearly fit into our idea of what a plant and an animal are. But then we get into things like microscopes, and in the mid-1800s, microscopes were developed and we could see tiny objects. This is a little bacteria, which is being visualized here with a very modern microscope. These are large microscopic organisms and algae and slime molds. And so these kind of don't look like either plants or animals, so we needed to figure out a way to group them. And with technology changing and developing, we're able to look at genetics and look at morphological features and under microscopes so we can see where these things belong if we're going to put them in groups. So taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms, and our current system was developed by a Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus is called the father of taxonomy. His Swedish name is Carl Linné, but he Latinized his name. And his system includes Latin-based names for all types of organisms. So he was looking at naming not just plants, but all life, animals included. So he lived in the 1700s, and he was the one who started out naming. And so this was slow and gradually took on more inertia as it went. So he had his system of nature. The Linnaean taxonomic system went from kingdom to species, and here we're looking at groups of organisms. So the largest group, including the most types of organisms, is the kingdom. We're talking about two kingdoms, two big groups of organisms, but he broke it down even further. And then when you get this big group, how do we separate those organisms? Well, we could separate them first by phyla. Phylum is singular. And then you take a phylum, you could break that apart based on, we're talking about based on physical appearance, morphological features, where things live, into class. Break a class down into order. Break an order down into a family. Family is broken up into a genus. Genera is plural. And then each genus contains one or more species. And species is the most specific type of organism out there. So you should use that species specific, and as we go up, we get more general into bigger and bigger groups. A good way to remember this order is King Philip came over for good spaghetti or good sandwiches, or you can make up your own funny little mnemonic device. Phylogeny developed just after the system of naming, and this is the science of the evolutionary history of life. So this is related. We name organisms, but then we want to put them into groups, and it makes the most sense to put things in groups that are closely related. So in the 1800s, Charles Darwin did research on biological organisms, followed by other researchers, and made scientists aware of the evolution of life, that organisms change over time, the populations, I should say, of organisms change over time. And we might start out with an ancestral species. Here we're looking at finches. Okay, a species long ago, and a population is a group of organisms of the same species. So imagine a population of one species of finches. Well, over time, some might go into trees, some might stay on the ground, and some might develop a certain type of call, warbler-like, or body shape. Well, those that go into the trees have kind of isolated themselves in an environment. They have a certain habitat, and they will differentiate in that habitat to make the best of their food source and their environment. And so we can separate into different species of tree finches. So this species is vegetarian. These all like insects, but they have different shaped beaks and different shaped heads, and these have different colors. So they have developed over time differences that allow them to be reproductively isolated. So this species doesn't breed with this species. This species, even though it's close to this one, doesn't breed with that species. A species is a group of interrelated organisms that interbreed together and produce viable offspring. So if these happen to breed together, being different species, they would not produce viable offspring. The offspring wouldn't be able to reproduce themselves. So they look alike, but they do not reproduce, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to continue their population. Okay, same thing happens with ground finches. We have separation of different groups and species. But in phylogeny, when we organize our species into a tree like this, you can see there are branches. And so each branch contains organisms that are related to some extent. So all these tree finches in this big branch are related, and then all the insectivorous tree finches are related even closer. So this vegetarian species has branched off. Then within the branch, these two are very closely related. See how their branches towards the outside, and these two are more closely related. So we're grouped into relationships, and those relationships can be supported through genetic research. So you'll notice in that previous slide that we had species with two-word names, and this is how Linnaeus developed his taxonomy. Each kind of life has a two-word name, and this is called binomial nomenclature. It includes the species name, a specific epithet, and the genus. The genus is always capitalized. The specific epithet is always lowercase. And when you're typing this out, you should always put it in italics. This plant here in the picture is Queen Anne's lace, or wild carrot. It's a native plant in New England. This beautiful umbrella-shaped floral arrangement at the top with a little dark flower in the middle. It's Daucus carota, and carota sounds like carrot. It's wild carrot. So Daucus carota is its scientific name. That's the binomial name that we use to determine this. And you'll see in chapter 16, it starts off by discussing the problems with just using common names. This has two common names that I know of, Queen Anne's lace and wild carrot. But there are probably others, and it's important that if we're being scientific, talking science with this plant, we should use this scientific name. So classifying life has gotten a little more complicated over the years. So in Linnaeus' day, biologists thought only of taxonomy naming, but as Darwin looked at evolution and phylogeny, the relationships of evolution, the relationships of organisms in terms of evolution, we started to lump these two together in this study called systematics, which is taxonomy mixed with phylogeny. So we named things based on the relationship that it has with other organisms. So for example, that might sound a little abstract. If you found a new species of plant, you would look at its features, look at its genetics, and if it was similar to wild carrot, you might put it in the Daucus genus. So it might be Daucus with a different specific epithet because it might be a different species. It's a whole new species. So maybe it would be Daucus massachusettsensis or something like that. So we might use the genus as its group, and everything else above it would be the same as Daucus carota, and then it would be its own species, have its own specific epithet. So we started with kingdom with Linnaeus, but scientists and botanists have split apart kingdom into subkingdoms, infrakingdoms, and superdivisions. Now in botany, instead of phylogeny, instead of phylum, we use division. So that's a little bit different. Then there are subdivisions: class, superorder, order, family, genus, species. So we have all these little groups within our grouping system now. And this might seem overly complicated, but as we look and try to categorize the millions of different species that we have, it is helpful. You're not going to have to memorize any of these that are not in bold, but I do want you to memorize kingdom, division, class, order, family, genus, species. So today, biologists and botanists seek to classify life based on systematics, based on naming and phylogeny, how organisms are related. We have around here the oak family, Fagaceae, and there are lots of different genera in this family. So this is the family name right up here. Two of the most common genera, genus, singular, in our area are Fagus and Quercus. Quercus is the genus of oaks. Fagus is the genus for beech trees. And so they're related at the family level. We could see that through genetics, and we could see that through leaf shape. They generally have the same leaf shape. They also grow in the same area. And then in Quercus, there are many species of Quercus. I'm showing red oak here, Quercus rubra, and chestnut oak, Quercus prinus. Oh, these two leaves look fairly different from each other. The acorns that these produce are different as well. Over in the genus Fagus, American beech is Fagus grandifolia, and you might notice the similarity in leaf shape between Fagus grandifolia and Quercus prinus. Pretty similar, okay? This one has more sharp, small teeth on the edge. This one has rounded, larger teeth on the edge. And this shows that we have a relationship, but we have differences, and that these differences have been reflected in the names, while the relationships we can see when we chart it out in a graph like this. This is called a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree. Some people just call it a family tree of life. And this is just one tiny piece showing 3 species. Can you imagine what something like this would look like with millions of species? Even thousands. It gets pretty busy. So I'll have part 3 of this intro botany lecture coming right up. So take a break and I'll see you in a bit.